Hello everyone, in this video we are going to learn about authentication in Azure Container Apps. And this is the inbuilt authentication functionality of Azure Container Apps that you can go ahead and just enable without making code changes. And this is very similar to the Easy Auth functionality that we've been having in Azure App Services for like 3 years now. This pretty much works the same way. And this method of authentication is applicable for like simple applications and enterprise applications that you develop. But I don't think this is going to be applicable for like the next Facebook or next Twitter that you're going to develop. And when you use this feature, there are two flows that you should understand. We have the server-directed flow and client-directed flow. If you want to authenticate a browser-based application, you can go with server-directed flow. If you want to authenticate an API, for example, API that is connected to a mobile application, you can use the client-directed flow. And in this video, I'm going to explain how this function works, how this authentication mechanism work, and then I'm going to show you a few demos on server-directed flow. And in my next video, I'm going to show you how you can use client-directed flow to authenticate APIs. So let's get started. As you can see here, I have deployed this demo application to Azure Container Apps. And now let me show you how easy it is for you to enable authentication for this application. Before enabling authentication, let me show you how the application looks. As you can see, it is a simple ASP.NET MVC application. There are a lot of headers. These are sent by my browser. And if I scroll down, we have the headers that the Envoy proxy, the proxy that Container Apps uses. These are the headers sent by the proxy, and these are the headers sent by the Kubernetes, underlying Kubernetes platform, and we see some information about the container app and the revision name as well. Now let me go back and go into Authentication tab, and let me show you how easy it is for you to enable this feature. I'm going to click on Add Identity Provider. As you can see in the list, we have all the major identity providers supported by Container Apps. I'm going to go with Microsoft. I can just create a new application in my Azure AD that will represent this application, or I can pick an existing application that's in Active Directory already, or I can provide the details of an existing application. This is an option if the application lives in a separate tenant. Now for this demo, I'm going to go with create new app registration, and then we have to specify the name of the application. I'm going to go with Auth demo app. Now we can select the account type for this application. We have the first option that only supports current tenant, and we have multi-tenant, and we have Azure AD plus personal accounts and personal accounts only. I'm going to go with any Azure AD directory and personal accounts option. Now let me scroll down. With this option here, we can allow unauthenticated access, or we can make the application require authentication before accessing. For example, now I can just use the application without authentication, but if I enable this feature, I will not be able to access the application without logging in. And for this demo, I'm going to go with this option. And with this option here, we can select the behavior for these unauthenticated requests. And as you can see, we have three options. We can direct the user to the identity provider with this option, or we can send an unauthorized response, or we can send a forbidden response. I'm going to go with the first option so that I'll be redirected to Microsoft for logging in. Alright, now I'm going to go into the next page. Now if I click here, add permission, as you can see, I can select these permissions that my application requires. I'm going to click update permissions, and then I can click this button here to add this identity provider to my application. Alright, as you can see, I have just added the identity provider, and now if I go into the application and let me try to refresh it, as you can see, I have just got redirected to Microsoft sign in page. Since I have already signed in this browser, I can go with this option here, and it is asking me whether I want to give access to this application. I'm going to go with yes. I have logged into the application. We have the option to sign out, and if I scroll down, we have 4 new headers, as you can see. And now if I go into Azure Portal and Azure Active Directory app registrations, here we have the application that we have just registered. And now if I go into the Authentication tab, as you can see, Identity Provider Wizard has even added the redirect URL of my application to this AD application as well. Now this is what I wanted to show you in this quick demo, how easy it is for you to add an identity provider to your application. Now let's understand how this feature works. Now as you can see on the screen, we have the client, and then we have the container app on the right, and this illustration shows what's happening inside of this container app. Now as you can see, when the request comes in, it first hits the ingress, and then we have the replica, and in the replica we have the application container. This is basically the application that we are deploying that contains the code that we have written. And when you enable authentication for this container wrap, what is happening here is that there will be a new container deployed in the same replica as this application container is in. And this container here, this is usually called as authentication middleware. This acts as a proxy to all the requests that the application container receives after enabling authentication feature. And as I said, this is very similar to the app service authentication feature that we had with app services. Now let's have a look at the app service authentication feature as well so that we can better understand how this works. And now I'm in the documentation page of authentication and authorization for Azure App Services. Let me scroll down a bit to see the architecture here. As you can see, the authentication and authorization middleware component is a feature of the platform that runs on the same VM as your application. Now basically app services, they run in VMs underneath. They're hidden from us, but they actually run in these virtual machines. As you can see in this architecture, we have the external web clients that are connecting to the app service, and we have the app service HTTP front ends, and we have the actual virtual machines. And this part here, this is similar to the ingresses in our container app. And here we have the actual web app that is hosted in IIS maybe, and we have the authentication middleware there as well. And this also supports, as you can see, all these IDPs that Azure Container Apps support, and we've been having this feature in app services for like 3 years now. And now if I go back into the feature architecture of container apps, you might have noticed this works in a very similar way to Azure App Services. We have the client, we have the ingress, and we have the replica, and we have the authentication middleware that does the authentication. But the only difference is that when it comes to app services, it was deployed in the same VM, maybe the same IIS instance as well as a separate application, but here we have this sidecar container running in the same replica. And this is a really interesting use of sidecar containers as well. And if you're not familiar with sidecar pattern is about separating cross-cutting operations from a microservice to reduce its internal complexities like logging, messaging, and monitoring. And in this case, it's authentication. And now let's have a look at a few attributes that this feature has. Since this is a sidecar container, you can use any programming language with this because this is totally separate from the application and this is running as a sidecar. And this feature supports Azure AD, Facebook, GitHub, Google, and Twitter, and also custom OpenID providers for identity providers. And when you integrate these identity providers to the container app, you can not only configure one, but you can configure multiple providers for the same application. And now let's have a look at this authentication middleware and what it actually does. This authentication middleware, this acts as a proxy to the web requests. This is the image that Microsoft has in the documentation page describing the feature architecture of this inbuilt Easy Auth functionality. This acts as a proxy to our requests, and this responds to paths, URL paths that contain this prefix here, /.auth. I want to explain them in a minute. And this allows only HTTPS traffic when you enable this. This basically read and validate the authentication or cookies that is coming from this client, and after validating them, this middleware appends a few more headers into the request that is passed in to our application container. Now let's have a look at the headers that are appended by the authentication middleware container. There are mainly 4 headers that this authentication middleware appends to the request. It adds this XMS client principal name, principal ID, and client principal, and the IDP provider. Now this is the application that we have deployed earlier. If I scroll down, we have some default container app headers, and we have these 4 headers. The principal name contains the email address, and the principal ID is the actual identifier of this principal in the IDP, and we have the type of IDP. For this I have configured Azure AD provider, and we have this client principal token, and this will contain a lot of information about the user who has logged into the system. And now let me copy this client principal token and go into jwt.io to see what's inside of it. As you can see here, we have a lot of information about the issuer and the name. These are the information that we need from the identity provider. And one other thing that you should keep in mind when you do this configuration is that I could not find a good library written by Microsoft to convert this token into ASP.NET application claims. But you can do this yourself easily. You just have to decode the token and inject into claims. Now let me go back. These clients, they're not allowed to set these headers. As I said earlier, this authentication middleware, it responds to URL parts that contain this auth prefix. And now let's have a look at the endpoints that this authentication middleware responds to. There are three types of URLs that this authentication middleware is responding to. We have logins, we have logouts, and we have callbacks from these IDPs. Now if you look at the logins, if you redirect the user to this URL here, and here we have the name of the container wrap and this part of this URL here. If you redirect the user to this URL after providing the name of the provider, for example, it could be Azure AD or Facebook, the authentication middleware, it'll start the authentication flows based on the provider name. For example, if you used Facebook, when you redirect the user to this URL here, it'll start the Facebook authentication flow. Basically, this authentication middleware, it'll redirect the user to Facebook. And in addition to this, we can pass in the post login redirect URL as well. Now let's look at this callback URL. The user gets redirected to these separate IDPs, could be Google, could be Twitter. And now this is the structure of this callback URL. You have to add the name of your container wrap, and then you have to add this to the end, and you can specify the name of the provider as well here. Now this is how you handle callbacks. The third type of URL that this authentication middleware supports is logout URL. When you want to log out a user from the system, you can direct the user to this URL here, /logout, and this authentication middleware will correctly log out the user from the system. In addition to this, you can pass in the post logout redirect URL as well, just like we did for logins. Now, when you work with this inbuilt Easy Auth functionality of Azure Container Apps, there are two flows that you should keep in mind. We have server-directed flow and client-directed flow. Server-directed flow is good for browser-based applications, for example, the ASP.NET MVC applications, the sample application that we have deployed. These types of applications, they are using cookies for authenticating users. So we should go with server-directed flow for those types of applications. But for example, if you have an API to authenticate, we should go with client-directed flow. This is good for mobile apps and basically any other device that is authenticating with this API we have hosted using Azure Container Apps. Now if you look at the server-directed flow, Container Apps authentication middleware manages everything. You just have to do the UI based configuration. You don't have to do any code changes in this flow. It's very easy to implement, and this is cookie based. But if you look at the client directed flow, your application, for example the mobile application, has to do all the heavy lifting when it comes to acquiring a token, and after getting this token, it should pass that token to Azure Container Apps middleware to get another token. I'm going to discuss this later in this video. And this has more steps than server-directed flow. And the server-directed flow is cookie-based, but the client-directed flow, it is token-based. Now, we have already seen how to configure Azure AD as the identity provider. In the beginning of the video, I have shown you how to do that. Now, this is the application that we have deployed in that demo. It is a simple ASP.NET MVC application that has this basic controller, and that just lists the headers of the request. And I'm attaching this code and all the scripts in the description down below if you want to follow along, if you want to experiment this yourself. This is the folder. We have the application that I've shown you, and that application contains this Docker build and push command as well. You can change this if you want. And I have already pushed this to my Docker Hub repository. And now let me go into this script here, deploy.ps1. I have used this script to deploy the application that I have shown you earlier. You can use this script here as a starting point when you experiment with these identity providers. Now let me go into Azure portal. As you can see, we have the app here that we have created earlier. And if I click on it, I'm getting redirected into the identity provider. Now let me close it and go into authentication. As you can see, we have one identity provider in the list, and the cool thing about this is that we can add multiple providers, and also we can delete the existing providers using the UI. Now let me delete this. As you can see, we are getting this confirmation message. Let me click delete here. We are getting this warning, and this is what I wanted to show you by removing this IDP. As you can see, all traffic is blocked because we have enabled authentication. The requests will receive HTTP 401. So basically what is happening now is that we have enabled authentication, but we haven't added an IDP. Now if I try to access the application again, I'm going back into the overview page and I'm clicking on the URL and I'm getting a 401 error. I'm going back into authentication page, and let me remove this authentication. And if I try to access the application now, it works without any identity headers from container wraps, and I don't see the sign out button as well. Now let me go back and into authentication, and now I'm going to show you how to add Google as your identity provider. Let me go into add identity provider page, and we can select which identity provider we want. I'm going to go with Google. Let me zoom this in a little bit. Now you can see this better. As you can see, we need to add the client ID and the client secret of the application that we register in the Google Developer Console. I have already done that. Let me go into Google Developer Portal. I have registered the application here, and we have the client ID and the client secret. Let me copy the client ID. I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to paste that here, and then let me go back and I'm going to copy the client secret as well, and I'm adding that here. As I explained in the beginning of video, we have two options. We can make this authentication a must, or we can just allow unauthenticated access. For this demo, I'm going to go with allow unauthenticated access. I'm just going to add this auth provider. The next thing that we need to do is we need to configure the callback URL for our Google application. For that, let me go into Google Console. As you can see, we have this section here of our application. We need to add the redirect URLs here. Now let me go back and copy the URL. I'm going back and then I'm going to paste it. We have to add the callback path as well. Now if I go into the documentation page of Container Apps Authentication and I'm going to search for callback, as you can see, this is the post authentication callback URL. I'm going to copy this and then I'm going to paste it at the end of the URL that I've already added, and then I'm going to add the provider. Since this is Google here. Alright, and then I'm going to save this application. Now let me go back into Azure portal. As you can see, we have the identity providers list here. We have Google. Now let me go back into application and let me try to refresh it. Yeah, this still works because I haven't configured the require authentication option. And let me go into this tab here. Here I have added few URLs, as you can see. As I explained in my previous presentation, we have these login URLs of our Container App Authentication middleware. Since we are trying to log in with Google, I'm going to click on this, but let me try clicking on Facebook. As you can see, we're getting not found because we have not configured Facebook as the authentication provider. But now let me click on Google. As you can see, I'm getting redirected into Google page successfully. Now let me add my email address and password here. Alright, I have added my email and password and logged in. I'm getting redirected back to my application and I'm getting this message, you have successfully signed in. I'm gonna click on this link. Now as you can see, I have my email address here and the sign out button as well because I have added this when I developed this sample application. And now let me scroll down, and as you can see here, we have my email as the client principal name and the client principal ID. As you may have noticed, this ID is different from the ID that I've shown you previously when I logged in through my Microsoft account. And then we have the principal IDP type, and that is Google, and we have the client principal token as well. Now let me go to the top of the page again and let's click this sign out button and let's see what happens when I click this. And when I click this, I'm redirecting the user to auth/logout and I'm passing in the post logout redirect URI as well. Now let's try to click on it and let's see what happens. As you can see, I'm logged out of the system. I'm redirected to my logout page that I have specified in the URL. And let's try to go into the home page again. As you can see here, we don't have the authentication headers. What that means is that Azure Container Apps Authentication middleware has logged me out from my Google account. Now in this video, we have looked at the server directed flow. We have seen how to secure a browser-based application using this inbuilt Easy Auth functionality of Azure Container Apps, but we have not touched client directed flow in this video. Since this video is getting too long than I expected, I'm going to continue client directed flow in my next video. Alright, now this is the end of this video. In this video, I wanted to explain how this authentication function works, and then I've shown you how to configure, how to authenticate your browser-based applications using this authentication feature. And in my next video, I'm going to explain how client-directed flow works, and then I'm going to show you a few demos as well. If you have other questions or comments, please let me know down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you learned something new today. I will see you with another video like this soon, and thanks for watching.